Oh, there you are, Doron, just off stage, listening in the wings to the hubbub of the audience.
Who was that?
It was Andy.
Andy, yes, I'm talking to a still of you. There you are.
It is now 2:30. Roger, do you want to unmute all?
All right. Right. Well, welcome to everyone. The latecomers are rushing in, even as I'm starting the introduction this afternoon. But thanks to Zoom, you don't have the embarrassment of actually having to walk in and be seen. So welcome to everybody. It's been interesting. The notice went out as usual for this meeting, and we've had I know that in welcoming everybody, we've some in the United States and also in Australia, where I suspect it will shortly be heading up to midnight. So thank you for coming to the meeting. I'm Roger Johnson. I'm the program secretary, and the lot fell to me to introduce Doron, who, as most of you will know, is our chairman. He took over in January, but of course, Doron's place in the CCS is one that goes right back to its beginning, because Doron, together with Tony Sale, brought the Computer Conservation Society into existence in 1989. And Doron has been a guiding influence on our activities since that time. Most of you, I'm sure, will know that Doron spent many years at the Science Museum in London and was assistant director and head of collections after a substantial period as the curator of computing. Today, as our chairman, and this is now by way of a tradition that shortly after taking office, the chairman, the incoming chairman, is invited to give a chairman's address. And today it's Doron's turn to do that. And Doron has taken as his title, Historiography of the History of Computing. And in his comments on the subject of today, Doron makes two comments that I'll quote, and then I'll hand over to Doron. Doron writes, "A task of history is to provide a coherent account of the profusion of past events." And that, I think, sets the tone for today. And then he wrote, historiography is concerned with how history is written. And this is his excuse for the title that he's chosen for today. So, Doron, welcome to the society that you co-founded more than 30 years ago. It's taken a while for you to become chairman, but we eventually twisted your arm, and we're delighted that you've done so. And we wish you all well for the coming 3-year term of office. So Doron, over to you for your talk to us today. Can I just add that we will use the chat facility if you want to put questions, and then we'll put the questions at the end, and we'll go through the comments that people have made. And if you, so you use the chat facility for questions. So Doron, over to you.
Roger, thanks very much. I do confess I was concerned that I would vanish in a puff of logical smoke. The reason is that the chair usually introduces speakers, and we are run into Russell's paradox here, Because if the chair introduces all those who do not introduce themselves, if the chair introduces himself, he doesn't, and if he doesn't, he does. And the answer to Russell's paradox is Roger, because Roger introduces those who don't introduce themselves. So is it the case that I need to share my screen now?
Yes, indeed.
You have a title slide?
We do.
Great. Okay. The question is, why historiography? Why can't we just carry on doing what we've always done, which is ponder circuit diagrams, count valves, find out how big ENIAC was, how many Pegasus computers were built, who were they sold to, what were they used for? What is wrong with just carrying on with this wholesome activity that we've all, in some sense, belong to the society to affiliate with? Why can't we do this without agonizing about what it is we're doing when we're doing it? So historiography is about the writing of history, how we write history, how we tell the tale, how we tell it, why we tell it the way we do, how we select what we choose to include, how we explain, interpret, or account for events. Who writes histories? Historiography has also been described as the history of histories. Why do we tell histories of the same events in different ways at different times? What is it about social events? What is it about our consciousness of the times that influences how it is we interpret things? So these are the kind of considerations that historiography engages with. I can't give you a compelling reason why we absolutely have to talk about historiography. The question is, do we need it? The answer is, well, we'll see presently. We can be productive historians without agonizing about meta-history, without looking at the philosophy of history. We would not be derelict in our duty as historians if we did so. We don't criticize or derogate scientists for not making explicit what it is they do when they do science. We don't ask them to spell out what scientific method is. Indeed, it would be very difficult to do so. We don't disparage them for not making explicit the premises and presuppositions of scientific conduct. Science is not meta-science. Science is not philosophy of science. These are different discourses. I had a stark lesson about this from Aaron Kluth, who's Nobel Prize winner in chemistry in 1982. I'd done 6 years of academic engineering, physics, maths, chemistry, a subject called electrotechnics, and then 2 years of control engineering. So I'd come out of university, what we would call an internalist, somebody who was engaged with engineering, electrical engineering. And I then did philosophy of science, and philosophy of science was a kind of intellectual homecoming. It was asking and answering, or attempting to answer, many of the questions that had engaged me as when doing science. What is it you do when you do science? What is it that science owes its supposed privileged access to certainty to? It addressed many of the reasons that I'd been engaged with that had emerged in the practice of science. When I read Descartes, Leibniz, Kant for the first time, I felt that they were talking to me. They were addressing these very issues. While I was enjoying this sort of philosophical epiphany in Cambridge, I met Aaron Kluth at a college event, which is the way things happen. And I expected him to confirm, endorse the fact that his huge success in science was because he had, in some sense, understood the philosophy of it, the presuppositions of it, had made these explicit. And I asked him what value he found in philosophy of science. And he looked at me slightly strangely and he said, maybe bedtime reading. He didn't mean that as a joke. He was being deadly serious. What I took from that is that you do not need to be explicit about what we do when we do science to be an effective practitioner. The presuppositions of science are baked into the practice of science. And it's the same about historians and historiography. One can be a practicing, I won't say unconscious historian, without being explicit or self-conscious about the principles upon which their practice is based. So Roger mentioned that I was curator of computing at the Science Museum for 14 years. What is not widely known, and which I will share with you, is that curators are governed by Ohm's law. Now, this isn't a reference to the transconductance of the human body. It's not a reference to or metaphor for resistance, that is the curator's resistance to dumbing down, resistance to the commercialization of knowledge, or the fact that there are more people in the marketing department in the museum than there are in the curatorial department. No. Ohm's law in relation to curators is an acronym, and the acronym is objects, history, and meanings. Now, the mandate for museums in science and industry is to maintain a material record of technological change through acquisitions and the creation and maintenance of collections. And curators are agents of that mandate. Curators are hugely, hugely privileged. Curators are the ones that make decisions about what will be preserved. That is to say, what the datum will be for future generations of historians to recreate, to create histories of our times. That is the responsibility. They, in a sense, can be invisible agents, that is to say, unconscious agents. They can reflect social values, social and cultural values, and make acquisitions that upon which one can construct histories about our times. They can tell the tale of our times. What they omit to collect leaves holes in our histories. And I use the totalizator as an example, the totalizator, which I'll come to, as an example of the rather exaggerated relationship between omission and oblivion. The implication being exaggerated, that if a curator does not collect, if there's no material record, then the artifact and the narratives and the episodes involved are consigned to, dare we say history? No, consigned to oblivion, precisely because they're not consigned to history. So, whoops. These are a bunch of totalizers. These are images about totalizers. Totalizers are large or huge electromechanical devices that are used to manage betting on dog and race tracks. They implement what's called the pari-mutuel system of betting. And in that system, the odds, the winning odds are not fixed. The winning odds change continuously in live response to the betting pattern. So as bets are placed, the actual odds change. Now, it's a legal requirement that the odds are made known to the punter or made known to the public at the time the bet is placed. Therefore, there's an obligation to have a real-time online management and processing of bets in real time, live, in order to create, in order to calculate the odds and to display them in real time. So these are vast machines, these huge machines. These are called tabletops. These are accumulators. These add up all the bets independently of denomination. They produce the pool, both collectively, that is all money placed on all runners and all money placed on any individual runner. And it divides the two to create the odds for a particular runner. So these are the tabletops, the accumulators. This is the odds machine, which does in real time online division. And this is a display, one of the very, very earliest displays, which records for the public in the public domain the results of the odds machine. And if we can look here, we can see that the gradations are irregular. And for those into this sort of thing, the reason for that is it's taking out a tan function, which is involved in the digital stroke analog computation of the odds. So these are vast machines. They're capable of managing hundreds of simultaneously operating ticket issuing machines. So you can place bets at hundreds of individual places. The machine is scalable. That is to say, you can have small units. That's a relatively small installation. This is a massive one from White City. This one here is the odds machine from the Haringey tote, which was taken out of service in 1987. So these are, they are fail-safe. In the event there's a power cut in the middle of a betting process, the information will be saved when the power is renewed. All information is saved and the whole process continues. It is also able to regulate peak loads and regulate and manage overload. So you have a very sophisticated system. The first of these was installed in 1913. They had product lives of 50, 60 years. Typically, the Haringey tote was taken out of service after 57 years. And Guy mentioned earlier in the pre-talk discussion whether there was any connection with Whirlwind, and there is a connection which we can go into perhaps offline between Whirlwind and Sage in terms of what is the machine of reference for a machine that has an equal balance between computational need and information management need. And the established canon place's whirlwind in that place. And here we have a machine which had a life expectancy of 50, 60 years. That actually did something very similar, and it is not in the canon. And the reasons why it is not in the canon are very, very interesting historiographically. It's an electromechanical machine, not an electrical machine. Does history privilege electronic machines over superseded technologies? And if so, why? And we will have occasion to revisit that. So the point about this is, these machines are not collected because they fall outside the existing canon of reference machines, machines that are illustrative and defining of what it is historical significance is. And if they are not collected in a museum, what is their fate? Yes, there are documentary histories, of course. The major histories are based on documentary evidence. But if we did not collect this, then material culture would miss a placeholder that signifies its narratives and significance. As it happens, the Haringey Tote Odds Machine is in the Science Museum collections, as indeed is the White City Tote Machine, the White City Odds Machine, and there are also examples of various other elements of the systems. So that's to do with sort of a sort of rather long-winded point about acquisition and oblivion, the contribution that material culture, artifactual culture, makes to the writing of histories independently and in consort with traditional documentary histories. Curators interpret objects. They seek meanings. They seek meanings for objects. And part of the mandate for curators is to make these meanings intelligible. So they are bridging the gap. Part of a curatorial psyche is to bridge the gap between esoteric, internalist, technical knowledge and accessible understanding, public understanding. And they do that through history. History is the discourse of narrative. History are the ways in which we frame meanings. So the rather not very funny notion that curators are governed by Ohm's law is that this is actually the fundamentals. These are the elements of what is going on in the museum culture: preservation, interpretation, and acquisition. So let us look at an example of how narrative confers meaning. And the example I'll take is the Apple I single board computer. This was designed by Steve Wozniak, 1975, in a garage in California. It was released in 1976. Only about 200 in all were made, of which 50 and 60, about 50 or 60 are thought to have survived. They change hands for between $500,000 and $1 million now. So we have the narrative here of Steve Wozniak, who had no commercial ambitions. He had no business ambitions for his machine. That was provided by Steve Jobs, his friend. Both of them were enthusiasts. The reason Steve Wozniak was, as he's called, built this machine was actually to impress his friends at the Homebrew Computer Club. He had no business or commercial ambitions for this machine. So we have a garage to multinational, the garage to multinational fortunes of Apple and the founders of Apple have become a parable of our times. The parable of entrepreneurial success, the countercultural individualism of the personal computer movement. So there's a narrative which goes around all this, which means that in many senses, this is as much a cultural object. In fact, it's probably more a cultural object than it is a technical object. So the story serves as an origin story for the mass production of the personal computer phenomenon. So there's a silly, simple, obvious example of how a narrative confers meaning. Now, what's interesting about this, apart from the narrative, is the fact that I mentioned that historiography has sometimes been called the history of histories. An interesting question would be, would this machine have the same prominence, would the single board computer have the same prominence now as it did in the 70s and 80s, when we were struggling for some grip on the wheel spin that the personal computer revolution was creating? Would we tell the same story? Would it occupy the same space? Would we tell it in the same way? Would what we see as significant be the same things we see now as significant in a story about a bunch of guys in a garage in California. So that's two examples of artifactual history and, if you like, historiographic issues. So I would say that being self-conscious about how we construct narratives, what contemporary values shape the tale, what is it we select as significant, these enhance sensitivities to potential meanings. In writing histories, I think it helps if we know whether we're influenced by the great man theory of history, whether we're swayed by the romantic idea of an heroic inventor, whether we're technological determinists, whether we believe that innovation drives change, or whether we're social determinists, or something in between, as most grown-ups are. Do machines make history, or do history make machines? Asked Robert Hellbronner in 1967. So historiography raises consciousness about how we tell the tale and the way we do so. It makes explicit the hidden features of our own understanding. Historiographic principles are not usually declared or spelled out in historical narratives, much the same way as in scientific method is not explicit in science. So why historiography is the question we're asking. In my case, it was the case of a professional curatorial responsibility, and that is to say, to better understand how we construct histories and to properly inform criteria and significance of acquisition. If we were more sensitized to the narratives, to the socio-cultural issues of the day, they may inform the ways in which we frame significance of artifacts to justify acquisition. The second thing is a cast of mind. And perhaps the best way I can illustrate what I mean, well, not everyone has an affinity with mathematics, not everyone has an affinity with philosophy. And the substance of that was brought home to me by Donald Kluth, who will be known to almost all of you. He's a luminary in the, what we could call perhaps the algorithmic arts. He's involved in a multi-volume work called The Art of Computer Programming, which has been in progress for some while. He's probably one of the most revered figures in computer science. He told me, as he has told others, that he was grateful for the creation of computer science departments, because these departments gave a sanctuary. They gave a place of refuge for the 2 or 3% of people with a particular cast of mind, which was, if you like, and I paraphrase here, a programmer's mentality. And he said, without the sanctuary of computer science departments, people with this particular affinity with programming, the ability to handle the massively exactness and precision of it, the strategic elements of how you construct algorithms, that these, without the refuge, without the sanctuary of computer science, well, these people would be displaced persons, wandering, as it were, lost in the world. So historiography is not for everybody, in the same way the philosophy of mathematics isn't for everybody. So the question is, do we need it? And I would say that in conclusion, to the throat clearing element of what I'm proposed to say, is that historiography is not an essential prerequisite of the practice of good history, but it helps. So the task of history, as Roger quoted from the blurb, was to provide a coherent account of past events, markets, breakthroughs, users, human motivations, contingent occurrences, change and consequence. One technique history uses is that of master narratives. It's a technique for marshalling the profusion of events to marshal and cope with otherwise unmanageable detail. So what it provides is a narrative, perhaps a unifying concept, a proposition or an account or an organizing principle to marshal otherwise overwhelming avalanche of detail. Without them, we are left with what David Link has called a voluminous, unordered list of facts, unquote, a database, if you like, without an index. Now, there are at least 3 identifiable master narratives that writers of history in computing have deployed in the last 45 years. That is, since the mid-1970s, when history of computing became recognized as a distinct field of study. And if one looking for time markers for when history of computing emerged as a distinct study, we have 2. One is this iconic book on the left edited by Brian Randall, which is The Origins of Digital Computer. This is a compendium of primary sources with massively insightful interpretive essays by Brian. This is 1975. This, if you like, is a marker in the sand about history of computing as a distinct study. The second is the first issue. This is the contents page of the first issue of Annals of History of Computing, which is issue 1, journal 1, July 1979. So those are two. So what we're talking about is when we start looking at histories of computing, and we start looking at how history of computing has constructed its own narratives, we go back to this, if you like, starting point. Of course, there was stuff before, but this, if you like, is when it emerged and people began to give it attention as something distinct. Now, the first master narrative I propose to look at, and I question whether it's a master narrative because it's not widely accepted as one, is a timeline history of innovatory highlights. And if they're groans, I'll understand why. And the reason is that timeline histories are widely discounted by professional historians, especially historians of technology, as ingenuous, unreconstructed, passé, undimensioned, unable to do justice to historical process. Timeline histories are favored by journalists. It reflects the triumphalist view that celebrates the onward march of progress, a drum that certainly trade journalists feel they need to thump. Timeline history of innovatory highlights is a progress narrative, and there's some investment in that. So I use timeline histories, and particularly when I say timeline histories, I'm referring particularly to histories that have, if you like, a single developmental line, one innovation after another. As Arnold Toynbee said, history is one damn thing after another. So I use timeline histories here as a model, as a device, as a straw man, as a pretext for talking about historiography and to illustrate how some narratives serve history better than others. And we can use the supposed deficiencies of timeline histories actually as a model and as instruction. So the second reason for running, and this is more important than anything else, the second reason for running the gauntlet and dealing with timeline histories at some disproportionate length here is that timeline histories are probably the most prevalent model of history amongst those who are not professional historians. And it is those actually that I'm most concerned it is those people who are not professional historians that I have in mind in trying to formulate some of these issues. That is to create some kind of self-consciousness about how it is we construct narratives. So let's deal with a typical chapter sequence out of a book, say 70s, 80s. And we looked at what is a book, excuse me, what is a book about history of computing tell us? How would it be constructed if we looked at it in the 70s and 80s? This is a typical chapter sequence. Ancient aids for counting and recording. We're talking about knotted chords, small stones, calculi, notch sticks. We then make it risen from counting to calculation. Tokens placed on counting boards, the wire and bead abacus, scale devices, rulers, sectors, proportional compasses. These are marked with divisions for calculation and measurement. Logarithms and slide rules. After the introduction of logarithms in the 17th century came slide rules. They had a useful life of nearly 300 years. Mechanical calculators. There was a burst of activity in the 17th century, and the tale shifts then to devices, mainly using numbered wheels. Schickard, Pascal, Leibniz are the classics there. And then there's a jump cut to automatic calculation machines from the 17th to the 19th century to Charles Babbage and his vast mechanical calculating machines for doing automatic calculations, supposedly, as we will see, for automatic production of mathematical tables. We then jump to Hermann Hollerith and the tabulator. And the tabulator was devised by Hermann Hollerith to process the 1890s United States Census. They feared that it would take more than 10 years. Censuses were held every 10 years. It would take more than 10 years to process the information for the last thing. So there was mechanization. This was a driver for mechanization. So we go from Babbage to Hollerith. We then have a kind of seamless segue to IBM and the office automation era. We then electronic computers. That would be the first generation vacuum tube machines, ENIAC, EDSAC, UNIVAC, Whirlwind, Sage. We then have inventions, the transistor, integrated circuit, the microprocessor. And then in the mid-1980s, you'd get a semi-apologetic section on personal computers. If it's slightly late in the 80s, you might begin to start talking about what was called the information superhighway, internet, and so on. That was a point at which historians, people telling the tale, were still struggling to come to terms with what it is that was happening. Not nearly enough time had elapsed to get any sort of perspective for it. So that is a typical narrative. Have I been speaking for half an hour? That is a typical narrative that we would find in the 70s and 80s, the earliest method of doing that. Now, telling the tale as a sequence of innovatory highlights has implications for how we understand the events described. And what I'm going to look at now is the implications of talking about innovation-driven change. So the linear format suggests a monocausal progression. The fact of something occurring after something presupposes that it occurred as a result of what came before. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, after this, because of this. And the association of the connection between assuming that causal connection is a result of succession in time, or that succession in time is a result of causal connection, is a fallacy that students of philosophy of science are warned against. It is not always the case that it's so. It's certainly the case in some instances. So mistaking succession in time for causal connection is something we're warned against. The idea of causal agency, of a single causal agency, encourages ideas of technological determinism and the predestiny of progress, as though it could not have been otherwise, because one thing leads to another. And this is what historians have difficulty with, and that's partly why this model is not something that is regarded as a particularly rich one. Right, in many such tales, need is often posited as historical cause, and preferably, of course, critical need. With the benefit of knowing how it all turned out, it's tempting to present innovation as a response to pre-existing need and often critical need. I'll give an example. The first relates to Charles Babbage. The received perception is that Charles Babbage invented engines because there was a tables crisis. The tables crisis was that there were errors in tables, and these were catastrophic. Ships would go aground, bridges would fall down, all the rest of it. And it's accepted by historians and almost everybody that certainly the jumping off point for Babbage was that, but also that was it was his enduring motive. Babbage invented machines to automate the production of tables. What is omitted from this is the fact that Babbage's primary concern was mathematics. His primary concern was the computational potential of computational machines. So where did the errors come from? Errors were retrofitted by 15 years after the conception by a scientific publicist called Dionysius Lardner, who made his money, who had a very profitable career giving public lectures and needed content for his lectures. Babbage's engines were celebrated, were great news. And he approached Babbage and said, I want to speak about your engines. Babbage explained what his purpose of the engine was. And Lardner said, the mathematics is too difficult for the public. Do we have another line into this? It was Lardner who used need, the crisis of tabular errors, in an instrumental way for his lectures, and subsequently to promote Babbage's interest, to revive a project that had already died. The project to build the engine had stalled after 11 years. And Lardner was supposedly helping Babbage by creating the tables crisis, which would say, it's imperative we have these machines to solve things. So there we have an instance where the people who used need as a necessary, as it were, cause, in inverted commas, used it instrumentally as advocacy, as political advocacy. They were contemporary actors at the time. There are other instances where need is completely inadvertent. And the illustration of that is much closer to our own times, and that is the stored program computer. Now, the internal stored program is widely regarded and generally accepted as the defining feature of modern electronic digital computer. Von Neumann, in his famous 1945 paper, first draft of a report for EDVAC, described storing and running a program directly from electronic memory. And that was part of the internal architecture of the computer. And this idea was almost universally adopted and is uncontroversially accepted as a defining feature. Now, as EDVAC type machines were built, a variety of benefits became evident, not all of which were anticipated. Now, in 2007, while I was a guest curator at Computer History Museum in the United States, I asked pioneers, programmers, computer scientists, practitioners, Stanford PhD graduates, what the significance of the stored program was. I'd expected that since it was an established feature, defining feature of modern computer, there would be some agreement about it. Each gave a completely different answer. Some answered speed, others said flexibility of being able to portion internal resources depending on the problem. Others suggested that it was the fact that if a program could operate on a program as an object, it opened the way for compilers and interpreters. I asked one first-generation computer of UNIVAC, first-generation programmer of UNIVAC, what is it he could do with this that he could not otherwise do? His answer was instant. He said, matrix inversion. So all were united that this was a defining feature, but there was no agreement whatever about what the significance was. Now, it's only relatively recently, that's in 2013, that the stored program feature has been fully historicized. And this is by Tom Haig, Mark Priestley, and Crispin Rope in a rather superb piece of work. Now, for all the intervening years, historians, computer scientists, and others had assumed that the stored program idea grew from the need for the benefits that had resulted. They had projected backwards benefits into an assumed need. That the practical and theoretical benefits that had emerged separately and collected were, in fact, the prior needs to which the stored program was framed as a response. So here we have a model of need being a driver of innovation that must be at least partly responsible for the remarkable neglect to analyze and historicize stored program ideas until about 8 years ago. That's nearly half a century it took for history of computing to address its most central concept. So, offer that second example of how assumptions about need framed as a legitimate driver shaped the narrative misleadingly for so long. We're running out of time, so let me just quickly highlight some other features of the idea of a single developmental line, why it is historians are bothered by timeline histories as linear evolution. One is replacement. That the new replace the old in a continuing cycle of replacement. That the implication is that innovation, invention, new techniques and devices were unconditionally welcomed by long-suffering practitioners who joyously dumped existing practices overnight in favor of the new. Okay, this is, needless to say, far from always the case. A response to the new was sometimes hesitant, sometimes hostile, and acceptance was often fraught. There are many examples which, if there's any interest in them, I can go back to. Not all beginnings were fraught. VisiCalc, the first killer app, had led a charmed life. So I've outlined some of using timeline histories as a kind of instruction, looking at its deficiencies to look at what is it that is excluded in such stories that we would wish to endow in a richer history. And I'm going to propose an answer. And that is what I've called the river diagram. Now, instead of a single developmental line, we can actually unplait the braid, if we like, into 3 separate threads. First is calculation, automatic computation, information management, communications, and these, as we know, converged into what has become called the information age. So calculation runs from ancient figure counting. A lot of these have ancient precedents. Manual things before mechanization, before machines, before technology began to aid, replace, and relieve human action. So calculation goes back to ancient finger counting. Devices that populate this thread include abacus, graduated sectors, slide rules. We can look at early mechanical, these are some of the paraphernalia of, sumptuous antiquity. And there's nothing wrong with sumptuous antiquity on a Thursday afternoon. Mechanical calculators are another part of this thread. And here we have the Pascaline. These are the classic iconic objects. You call my arithmometer, the Muller, testament to the instrument maker's art. And very interestingly, in stylistic terms, the facet calculator, Swedish key-driven, pin-driven pinwheel machine. And it's terribly interesting to see the mass production, the style of a mass production artifact in relation to craft objects that come from instrument makers' traditions. But that's digressing into a curatorship and artifactual culture. Now, the heyday of mechanical desktop calculators were the early decades of the 20th century, and the framed brands include Brunsviga, Burroughs, Felton, Tarrant, and Facet. That's a little Facet machine here. And the point about this entire thread is that it requires the informed intervention of the human operator to get useful results. That's why it is distinctive. Now, there are important devices that are part of this tradition that are not blessed with breakthrough technology. And this is the point about one of the deficiencies about timeline. And one of these is the commutator. And I don't know how many of you have heard of a commutator, but here is one. Here's the very one that's sitting on your screens. It's a rather extraordinary device. It has no breakthrough technology in it, but it had huge use. It's a hand-operated portable adder, sometimes called a chain adder, that accumulates a running total of multiple serial additions. It was perfect for shopkeepers, for merchants that would tot up. It uses a stylus, which is sitting over here, and you just run the stylus down the number you've put in, and it accumulates in an accumulator here. Now, this had huge impact. It does not involve massively complex technology. Typical use. Right. Now, the spacing of the digits, interestingly, is the exact width of the spacing of a ledger. So you could copy so the part of the practice was to copy the totals straight into a ledger. It's compact, it's robust, it's beautifully crafted, it's very, very heavily used, judging by the wear of the chrome on it, and it needs no batteries. It was made in the United States and Europe in the late 1890s and sold very well into half of the 19th century. Now, the commutator lives in the shadow of its celebrity cousins. It does not share the podium with contemporary firsts, the Brunsvigas, the Burroughs machines. It's barely known. The model innovation-driven change omits minor devices of this kind, however widespread their use and practical value. That is what gets omitted when the emphasis is placed on innovation. So creating a separate thread for calculation, if you write, reinstates continuity and the continuity of aspiration and ambition of the practitioners and technologies that were involved. So even if there are technological breaks in these threads, in these tributaries, it is not appropriate to represent them here, because what we're representing here are the human activities, the continuity of human activities that were relieved, replaced, or that were relieved, assisted, and replaced by technological devices. Automatic computation starts with Babbage. 1821. There's no ancient precedent for this. It didn't come entirely out of the blue because there's precedent for everything. Nothing comes from nowhere. But the technology actually has a fresh start. It does not have ancient precedents in manual. It has the manual stuff is in calculation. That's where its ancient precedent is. We know Babbage failed to complete any of his engines in its entirety. He built these vast mechanical calculating engines. The one that was built, the difference engine 2, which is a small one, weighs 5 tons, has 8,000 parts. Massive, massive investments. With Babbage, with the death of Babbage and the death of, in 1789 and the death of Ada Lovelace in 1852, the most energetic protagonists of automatic computation died. It was a false dawn in a sense, and there was what Leslie Comrie called 100 dark years before automatic computation was revived in the 1830s, in the 1930s, with firstly electromechanical and then with electronics. But there is no gap here, because the aspirations, ambitions, and intentions, the continuity is preserved as even if potential, although much more so. So those are what the threads imply. Information management. Okay, that represents the activities and techniques for information processing, storage, and retrieval. Like its first thread, its roots can be found in the manual methods of antiquity, and so on. Communications, we're going to spend less time on communication than almost any other. 1890s. Okay, the point about information management is it's concerned with large volume data throughput. Hollerith's tabulator managed to process punched cards, and it did that very effectively. The point about it is that the computation element was relatively trivial. What it is was doing accumulation of totals. So the emphasis is different. It's data throughput, and in the case of automatic computation, it's numerical calculation. Now, the fact that in the timeline chapter sequence I did, that Hollerith follows Babbage is little short of bizarre. There's very little, there's no known influential connection between the two, apart from the fact both use punch cards. One is a totally different emphasis. It's information throughput. The other is numerical calculation. And so having a more dimensioned map of this kind solves problems of that kind, or at least it alleviates problems of that kind. And the 1890s, there is, if you're looking for one, if one's looking for a single point, a marker, date marker for mechanization, then we're talking about that. Communications. Yep. Okay. Greek fire beacons, talking drums, military bugles, flags, moving arms, occulted lights, semaphore, all that stuff is its antique precedent. And what we're talking about communications really is electronic communication, telecommunications. Tele Greek mean far off. So shouting very loudly actually is telecommunications. And what we're really talking about and have in mind is telegraph, telephone, fax machine, radio, television, geostationary satellites, fiber optic cables, all the rest of it. So if we're looking for date markers, 1913, totalizator, the emergence, the balance, where the balance between computational capability and information management capability, managing 300 to 500 up to 1,000 ticket issuing machines simultaneously, processing the information, doing real-time computation on that. I'd say the emergence of automatic computation information management can be dated from totalizators. 1890s Hollerith, and 1970, I'd say the emergence of information management communications into the whole stream. Say that the digital automatic telephone exchanges, we can say 1970. So that's the river map. Right. Now, one of the points here is calculation didn't stop when automatic calculation started, as implied by the linear thing. I think we've hammered the timeline issue quite long enough. The epilogue for the whole desktop calculator thing is, of course, the solar-powered credit card side calculator. That, if you like, is the epilogue. So it goes from stones and pebbles for counting all the way through to throwaways, giveaways, electronic solar-powered calculators. Okay. We need now to talk about Colossus. I'm sorry, we need to talk about Colossus. Now, something that has always bothered me about Colossus are the claims made for it, the public claims made for it. We have on the TNMOC website where the Colossus rebuild resides. It was the world's first electronic computer. From the Telegraph, we have the full Monty. We have the Colossus, the world's first ever programmable electronic computer. And we have a commemorative postage stamp, which says, Colossus is the world's first electronic digital computer. So that must be so. That was, yes. Now, the public narrative follows the favorite tropes of tabloid history, many of which embodied the movie The Imitation Game, which is released in 2014. Here we have supposedly Alan Turing, played by Benedict Cumberbatch as the misunderstood heroic genius who's pitted against impossible odds and prevails against villainous enemies. The movie is a gratuitously fictional account based sort of on the efforts of Turing and Bletchley Park and the Bletchley Park codebreakers in World War II. The movie is an inglorious mashup of myth, occasional fact, wishful thinking, and some magnificent tosh, all of which reinforces tabloid perceptions about what is known to have happened. What is known to have happened. It's not a bad movie, it's just absolutely terrible history. Now, because of secrecy and technical complexity of the Bletchley Park decryption process, there was an information vacuum that was filled with anecdote, speculation, and fragmentary witness accounts, with little opportunity to corroborate this independently, given that there was so little technical detail available. Now, what always made me uncomfortable about claims made for Colossus, it was unclear upon what technical knowledge such claims were based while this technical knowledge was still under wraps. The circuit diagrams are not in the public domain, and it's taken decades to loosen the wartime restrictions of disclosure. So why is all this significant? Because in modern histories, the principal currency of merit and distinction is the extent to which a machine or device was anticipated, was a staging post, and preferentially influenced the modern digital general purpose programmable digital computer. And that seems to be the sole terms in which honor is bestowed. So people who were quite properly concerned to secure recognition for Colossus, with which it is absolutely deserved, had only to appeal. The only model they could appeal to is a prototype of a modern digital computer. And that is what, as I believe, is why it is these claims were made. So the only currency of historical significance seems to be the triumphalist success of the modern digital computer, and anything that aspired for recognition would have to subscribe to that particular trope. So I've always felt that, well, Colossus is included in the canon, certainly, but I've always felt that it's had to impersonate a digital program electronic computer to do so. It is like an unwelcome guest or welcome guest at a party, but they're under false pretenses. So Colossus has now been responsibly historicized, this by Tom Haig and Mark Priestley again. And the analysis is founded on a sound technical detail and published in 2 major journals in 2018, so that's quite recent. Now, Colossus was a special purpose machine specifically for decryption of the Lorenz traffic. It did bitstream processing and logic. This being the case, it does not fit comfortably in the thread of automatic computation, which is taken as numerical calculation, which is the role that came to define computers of that time. So Haig and Priestley's analysis question whether Colossus can meaningfully be categorized as a computer at all, and whether there's any meaningful sense in which it might be thought to be programmable, taking account of what these terms meant and came to mean. So where does that leave Colossus? What about the plaudits of history? Well, our river diagram provides some help here. The overall context of Colossus is communications, not numerical calculation. It was designed for the German High Command to communicate with the field using encrypted radio messages. Now, as well as these automatic decryption techniques using things like Colossus, Bletchley Park also used manual techniques, graphical, tabular, logical, to reveal hidden informational patterns and hidden information patterns. Now, these manual techniques are part of information management thread. So in the 4-thread scheme, the Colossus program is better placed in communications thread and the information management threads. It should not have to impersonate a general purpose programmable digital computer in order to be celebrated. Right, I mentioned unbroken continuity of need and use. And this is a crucial and key deficiency in the linear model, because traditions of use and development did not stop when automatic computers became available in the case of calculators. Now, single development lines are reductionistic, and what they strip out is parallel continuing practice. And if we look now at the product service life in the calculation thread, we can see, firstly, there's a rolling overlap as machines supersede other machines. Slide rules were operative for nearly 300 years, in fact, over 300 years. They end, okay, where these things start and stop changes. Some of them adopted slowly, some have taper into disuse, some of the cessations are quite abrupt. Slide rule was used in one form or another for over 300 years. Its demise was abrupt and immediate, in the 70s with the electronic scientific calculators. The step drum arithmometer had a bizarre revival, was superseded by pinwheel calculators, the keywheel calculators, had an extraordinary revival in the form of the kurta. That's this little extra bit here. So there was a cessation where the step drum calculator, the technique used for the arithmometer, was revived in the kurta, which is very well known to you. And here is one to give you some idea of scale. It's like a little antique spice grinder. It's got a little handle on which you turn on the top. So there was a curious, there was an interruption there. There's a hiatus in the development continuity of the technologies, and that cannot be represented in the linear way, and so on. So the point about it is, within each thread, there are fibers, which is what I've called this the fiber diagram. But I think we're busy pressing the metaphor too far. Okay, we can get close to wrapping up. I mentioned master narratives and spent a disproportionate amount of time on something that actually isn't acknowledged as a master narrative. I used it, as I said, as a device, as a heuristic device, as an instruction to identify aspects of richer narratives that we would regard as rewarding. I've used it as a way of speaking about ways in which we construct narratives by using examples which are not well served. And it's not a bad model to judge, historical treatments that have emerged since then. Now, these later treatments are informed by ideas that were migrated from the humanities, issues of relativism, social constructivism, agency, audience. These are things that internalists, and it was engineers, technicians, practitioners who wrote the histories of computing to begin with. These ideas have migrated from the humanities and progressively ingressed into new master narratives. Now, there are two accepted master narratives in the history of computing. The first is the computer as a machine for mathematical, scientific, and engineering calculation. That is, the computer as scientific tool. And the machines of reference here are the machines created between the 1930s, early 1930s and the 1950s. Historians responsible for this characterization include people who are very familiar to us: Herman Goldstein, Metropolis, Jack Howlett, Mike Williams, whose influential works date from the 70s and 80s. And it's upon those works really that are based the timeline notion. The second master narrative frames the computer as an information machine. So first is scientific tool, next is information machine. Corporate office systems. Its scope extended to real-time and software for non-mathematical purposes, text editing, communications, data management. This was the age of large mainframes and of IBM, the personal computer boom of the late 1970s and 80s, email, and ultimately the internet. Now, historians who articulated this framing include Martin Campbell Kelly, Bill Asprey, Paul Ceruzzi, and James Cortada, whose defining works were published mainly in the 1990s. There are two very durable works by those authors, and all of them are coming out in new editions. So the durability of these master narratives of machine as scientific tool, machine as information processing machine are lasting. They are renewable, they are adapting. So I've dealt with one master narrative. I've briefly, fleetingly mentioned two dominant master narratives: machine as a scientific tool and information information. Now, the information machine is an interesting one because it is not just characterizing. I believe, and Martin perhaps can fill us in here. I believe it grew out of a need to portray, and a very effective portrayal, reflection of the use to which computers were put during the big data processing, the mainframe era. I don't know that it was intended as an existential statement that the nature of computing is as an information machine, because after all, what do computers do? They take one string of numbers, convert them into another string of numbers according to rules. I do not wish to trivialize a massive and complex profession, but the idea of calling a computer information machine is actually a very quite profound existential statement. I don't know, and I question whether it was intended that way. But the point about it is, even if it is a durable existential statement about the nature of a computer, what it does not incorporate are the new contexts, the new hosts to which machines are put, computers are put. And that is gaming, entertainment, leisure. So I will now close by outlining the half of this presentation, which I haven't given, which is what is the future of history? And I will just give you the headlines. And those are the need for a new master narrative, which accommodates, if we can capture this, which accommodates the new usage to which computers are put, their new hosts. The second thing is software. And software is really problematic. Software did not exist 70 years ago. Software did not exist 70 years. It's a completely new artifact. We have no models for its creation. It does not behave like an industrial object. We cannot produce it like an industrial object. All those models fail. And software is not integrated into the histories of computing. There is a lot of written about software history, about the history of programming languages. Martin's book on the software industry is beginning to fill things out, but software is still not integrated into the narrative history of computing, which has, as Mike Mahoney said, we have kept too close to the machine, and that still remains the case. So integration of software, and if you like, the functional specificity of a computer is in its software. A computer is a generic machine. What it specifically does is determined by its software. And since the agency of a computer in the world is what it does, you could say that the future of the history of computing is the history of software. Thirdly, decentering the computer. The computer is disappearing into our own environment. Internet of Things, drivable cars, microcontrollers in washing machines, in kettles and all the rest of it. It's decentering in another way. So the point about decentering is the machine, the computer, ceases to become the protagonist in its own narrative. We start talking about the washing machine. We start talking about the car. It happens to be enabled by a very clever computer, artificial intelligence, and so on. There's a second sense in which the decentering is that where is the center of innovation going to remain? Will Silicon Valley, the Anglo-American centric view of this, or will it be Beijing or Tokyo? So the question of decentering where innovation resides. And finally, the integration of regional histories. Mir, Strela, Besem. These are Russian computers. Mesem, Besem, Strela, Mir. They don't mean anything, or they may do. But they don't have the cultural resonances of Pegasus, Colossus, Edzak, Edvac. Regional histories are not integrated into the mainstream history, which is mainly originally Anglo-American and increasingly American. So the future of history, I would say, will address issues of the new narrative, a new master narrative, software, absolutely critical, the decentering, which is a deeply interesting socio-cultural issue, and integration of regional histories into mainstream histories. And with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Doron, thank you for that tour de force. Not surprisingly, it's generated numerous questions as we've been going along. I think there's a question here from in this, early on, really, in your talk, Jeff Sharman makes the observation that archaeology is based entirely on artifacts. Is your premise, or is one of your premises, that we need an archaeology of recent times?
Certainly, artifactual history of computing involves archaeological principles, no question. But I was less advocating for how it is we ought to do history than to raise consciousness about how it is we do it anyway. So it was less a question of, I felt it was less a question of, do we or do we not need archaeological models in artifactual history of computing? The answer is unquestionably yes. But I wasn't embarking on an advocacy about how it is we ought to do this. I was arguing more than anything for a self-consciousness about what it is we do when we do it, and why it is we tell the tale the way we do. Can we become aware, insofar as it's possible, for the hidden presuppositions, just as scientists practice science without spelling it out what they're doing? Can we better understand what it is that appeals to us in the telling of our narratives? If we believe in, the great man theory of history, then we're going to migrate. We're going to migrate towards a particular kind of history. So it was less a question of we ought or ought not to do archaeology. It's more a question of why would we be doing? What appeals about the archaeological model? What appeals about that? Now, David Link, as we know, is one of the most, has produced one of the most intellectual justifications for archaeology in preservation of working artifacts. What he's saying is that in over 50 years, it takes 50 years for an object to become a mystery before, unless it's used actively. It takes 50 years for an object to become a mystery and for its intention and aspects of its use to be lost. So he's saying an archaeological principle is absolutely indispensable to the preservation of computing history because they involve working artifacts. So it's an archaeology of working artifacts compared to an archaeology of static artifacts, which is primarily what traditional archaeology is, the shards of the vase and all the rest of it. So so it was less a question of how it ought we do it. I wasn't trying to provide a recipe for saying we're doing it badly. I was saying, can we be more? Can we improve what we do? Or can we change what we do? Or will it be useful to think about how we do it when we do it? And no more than that, no more than that.
Thank you for that. Andrew Herbert wondered whether your river diagram should include an automation branch for process control, avionics, automated phone exchanges. I debated. I took a long time to develop those 4 threads because we waited long and hard. Control was one that came in and out for a long time. I think Andrew's being mischievous. It's a very, very good question, and I would have to think about it because we try to distill it. And they are relativized to the kind of anecdotes I told. I was addressing particular episodes in history and so how can we resolve these? And automation wasn't one of them at the time. Extending it would be a very interesting program. If we extended this now, it would be very, very interesting. So if I can take that if I can take that away with me and think about it, and I will do so with great interest. Yes, to see, can we have another elemental, can we have another atomistic thread that actually embodies something? We need to find something completely distinctive about that, that is not an amalgam of the content of other threads. But thank you, yes. Andrew, if you're on the call, I don't know whether you'd like to make a further comment.
Sure, sorry, just finding the unmute button. I resent being called mischievous. It's not my nature at all. I've been thinking further on that point, and arguably it's buried in automatic computation, because most process control things are essentially based on some sort of internal simulation to predict behavior to which the control system responds. So I think if I'd been sitting in Doron's chair, I would have hidden it in automatic computation. But I think, yes, it does need somewhat wider discussion. There was also someone who asked about analog computing, where that fits in. And you know, I made a reply in the chat that you can shoehorn that probably into automatic computation, but analog computing also correlates quite a lot with early days of control. First control systems I experienced were analog systems being reprogrammed for digital machines.
I think, Andrew, I can be a better advocate for your case than you have. and that is this, that, okay, where does a robot fit in my river diagram? It doesn't. And the reason is it's active in the world. What's distinctive is it's active in the world. Everything in the river diagram is static. And I would say, just thinking on my feet here, that there is a case for a separate thread of things that have material agency in the world and not just static. I think, where would you put a robot? A robot does not fit in the river diagram.
I think you're right. Robot does clearly call in another stream. Though, of course, yeah, mainframe systems running finance aren't static in the sense of, you know, tonight's bank balance determines whether the Herbert family eat tomorrow.
But that's, we're talking now about a thread of physical agency.
Yes, I agree.
Yes,
that's a good thread to have.
and that would be very intriguing.
Yes.
And it'd be very intriguing to see what the relationship, the confluences of the other threads, and whether we can make an intelligent London Underground map of that, or whether they're going to be crossovers and other funny things. That's a very intriguing question. Thank you.
I think there's going to be a braid rather than a convergence on a single thing.
Yeah.
Would you like to comment further, Doron, on analog computing and where that fits? Is that part of that braid that you've just mentioned? Several people commented on analog computing. Also, a questioner commented on large clock type devices that show the movement of moon and planets and so on, even back to the Antikythera.
Yes, that's very good. The astronomical instruments are really part of a tradition of instrument making, which really go into calculation, the calculation thread, the continuous calculation thread. The reason being because they aid, assist, replace, relieve actions that humans were doing to predict and compute. So I would say astronomical astrolabes and so on, definitely in the calculation. Analog computing, I would put again in calculation, because the traditions of Babbage and onwards were effectively digital. And the traditions of analog computing, even electronic analog computing, came out of electronic instruments. In fact, in museum collections, they're classified as mathematical instruments. So I would say, again, it's tradition, the tradition of their use and the aspiration of the intention. So there is a strong sense in which analog computing comes under automatic computation because they were automatic and they computed. But I'd say that in a temporal, in terms of a temporal classification, they have their one foot firmly in the computation, in calculation thread, in the calculation thread.
Dick Leatherdale, the editor of Resurrection, wonders whether your distancing of Colossus from the mainstream by reference to numerical calculation. If you remove the word numerical, so you just had the word computation, would that not reduce the distance?
Why do we want to reduce the distance? Because the only currency of honor is the automatic digital computer. Doesn't Colossus have no distinctive worth, value, independently of that? The answer, okay, that was a rhetorical question. It was a kind of friendly challenge to Dick. I've used the word computing and computation almost interchangeably, and I'm slightly uncomfortable about that, because in this particular context, you need a greater determination. It's underdetermined. What we're talking about is undetermined. Computation I use in the context of numerical calculation, and computing I use in the context of symbolic manipulation according to rules. So when we talk about general purpose computing, I generally talk about computing, and we talk about numerical calculation, talk about computation. The point about Colossus is it was not intended as a computational machine. It was intended as a machine to decrypt. It wasn't designed to do calculation. It wasn't designed to do what I would call computation. It did bitstream processing and statistical logic. And it didn't use it. So the fact that you could alter what it did is no great basis for claiming that it is programmable. I go back to the Hague-Priestley analysis. What they're looking at, so for Dick to say, for you to say, talk about computation and that will reduce the distance. The point about it is that what defined what was meant by a computer at that time, what defined what was meant by a computer at that time was in terms of numerical computation, in contemporaneous terms. So if you're looking at the etymology of the word and you look at what was contemporary, then we look at the usage, and this is the analysis that Tom and Mark do. They look at how were those terms used at the time and how have those terms changed. And the case is that it's very difficult to see Colossus as a computer. Not very difficult. I mean, saying one would raise the question, what do we mean by saying it's a computer? And the reason we're trying to say it's a computer is because we want it somehow to reflect the glory in the great triumphalist way of the modern digital electronic sword programmed computer. Now, in the same way that my little computator was actually quite an influential device. It was completely insignificant in technological terms. And now Colossus was massively significant, but it was also unique. And therefore, why should it need to trade on the excellence of some other model in order to be appropriately celebrated? In the same way, Babbage's engines, yep, it's a Turing machine. It's Turing complete. Babbage engine is Turing complete, and this somehow is a massively arrogant conference of distinction to Babbage. Babbage had no conception of Turing completeness. So, can we take it in other words? So, there's what's going on here is explanation by reduction to the familiar. That was good because something like it succeeded hugely, and so the terms in which we see its goodness or the terms in which were subsequent success, but there are other terms in which it's good, which didn't necessarily flower into something that was monumentally important. And so there's a question of, can we appreciate what those were? And I said that has distracted us from appreciating what actually Colossus did. The statistical methods used in that thing only came to light relatively recently. The TUT stuff, the stuff that was released from the National Archive, was relatively recent. So all the claims that were made in ignorance of what this, not in complete ignorance, in partial ignorance of what this machine was doing. So we now need to revisit it and say, is there a new category? Is there another category with which we can celebrate, through which we can celebrate Colossus? Just appreciating what it did. So I was just using examples of how we constructed narratives, really. Looking at historiography in the context of history of computing. How do the episodes in history of computing, the central episodes in history of computing, Colossus, a major machine of reference, fit into an historiographical narrative?
There is this problem, it seems to me. I'm a trustee of the Turing-Welshman bomb rebuild, which is a special purpose high performance search engine. Basically, you set up a menu and you went searching, and it uses heuristics and so on. And the difficulty is that it seems to me, in terms of talking about the significance of what the machine did and looking at it as part of a more general class, is that it did it before. Today we can talk about a search engine and many people understand the term. At the time, the term, I think I'm right, didn't exist. and it's therefore struggling all the time. I mean, there's no argument the bomb is not a computer, but it is a search engine, and high performance search function is something that is a common underlying technique used in many modern computing applications.
This is a wonderful example. There's a wonderful example you've given. Why is it we dismiss the bomb? It wasn't a computer. Also, it's electromechanical. Now, very frequently, you hear words like mechanical prehistory of computing, electromechanical prehistory of computing. You can go all the way right up to the chip, and you'll talk about what you call it, a small-scale integration prehistory of computing. Where does history start? The subtext of all this is that history starts with large-scale integration, electronic, digital, automatic computing, and everything else is prehistory. I would say the bomb has been as much victim of being electromechanical as it has been in terms of, so exactly what you're speaking about is, what did it do in terms of trying to solve what it is the challenge was at the time as the primary question. Then the question is, where can we locate it? And it may be we can't locate it anywhere, because that has never repeated itself. And the distinction and the expertise, the ingenuity, the creativity, even genius that went into making it may be not translatable. That you can't say there is something known that is like this and therefore that is good. It needs to be good in its own right. And the first question is to appreciate what it did. And as I said, what bemused me, what puzzled me, what made me uncomfortable about Colossus were the claims being made without the analysis. And that's no fault of the people that did it. I mean, this isn't making a dig. It's saying, you know, there was an information vacuum, and these things filled the, you know, the people did as well. I don't doubt that there are instrumental views of advocacy that informed claims for Colossus, but I don't believe they've been studied in the way, I don't believe they've been historicized in the way that would identify what was so special about them, that would allow us to celebrate them separately from having something else which succeeded, which we accept is good.
Yes.
And I think a bomb is a very good example.
Yeah. We have just a few, well, we have a great many comments, very complimentary ones for the talk. There are a few more questions. I wonder whether Maura Matassi from the United States is on the call.
Yes, I'm.
Well, would you like to put your question?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm not from the world of the history of computing. I work on digital media, and this has been absolutely fascinating for me. I'm curious about whether digital environments, I'm thinking, for instance, of social media platforms like Instagram or Facebook, or even tools that we use to communicate with each other, like WhatsApp, could be actually represented in the space of a museum. I'm thinking that these are objects that work actually as environments, digital environments. So I'm wondering whether there are any ways of actually represent these environments in embodied ways in the context of a museum. Thank you so much.
In the context of a museum?
Correct, yes.
Okay, that's a wonderful, wonderful and terribly difficult issue. And I've published some stuff on it, and that the question is really to do with the meaning of software. Is there any meaning you can give to software as an artifact if it is non-working? It is unlike any known artifact. The physical manifestation of software is not intelligible. And therefore, to what extent does it conform to a traditional artifact? You cannot read it. It is unlike any other medium. And the question is, if the function of software is to produce dynamic interaction, it is meaningless to keep it unless you can reproduce that. And the problem is the massive difficulty of doing that. The question of legacy platforms, the question of so I've written something about that. I'm very happy to send it to you. It doesn't solve the problem, but it raises the questions. It says, what is the difficulty here before we can even begin to solve it? There are people working it in Holland. His name escapes me now, but he's given a huge amount of thought to this. Huge amount of thought. He's saying software is meaningless unless it runs live. Okay, here's an extreme example. Would it be meaningful to preserve gaming software. Surely the whole point of gaming is the interaction with the gamer. You know, is it meaningful to keep software that is unlike that without the prospect, without the capability, or even the prospect of ever running it? So the best thing is I can send you that, and I can put you in touch with somebody who's given a deep thought to this.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Brian Randall has an interesting comment. Brian, are you on the call?
Yeah,
Brian?
yeah, sure. I was looking for the unmute button. Hi, Doron.
Hello, Brian.
Great. Hi. I really enjoyed that. I expected to, and I did.
Thank you.
Let me tease you with the comment made by Ken May to me years ago. There is as much bad history as written by historians who don't understand science as by scientists who don't understand history. Assuming for the moment that you agree with Ken, what can and what should we try and do about that? The emphasis is on the can.
Yes. It has always been a problem in history of computing, in that the kinds of people who have vast, deep technical knowledge are not necessarily people who habitually, who their mental currency is concepts and ideas. I mean, cultural issues. And so there's always been an issue of authorship. There tends to be fantastic internalist technical literature, and there tends to be terrific history, ill-informed. I think Mike Mahoney was, and the number of people who have their roots deeply in the technology, who then emerge into history is very, very few. You are one amongst very, very few. Mike Mahoney was another. And the trick is, it is very difficult to combine internalist knowledge and a narrative knowledge, a narrative capability in one person. And I think, so in answer to the question, I would point to the hugely productive partnership between Tom Haig and Mark Priestley as an example. You know, the deep knowledge of Colossus, that was the foundation of those two articles, informs and gives authority to the larger historical issues, which somebody completely internalist may not be interested in or sensitized to. So I think it's having an historian who can interpret the authoritative internalist stuff to translate it into a currency that is conceptual and intelligible, that is culturally intelligible. So I would say, how do you get all these, how do you get the different aspects of expertise into one place? You can't find it in one person. It's very, very rare. It's very, very rare to find this in one person. I would use an example of your essays in the 1975 book, Origin of Digital Computing. The essays between the chapters are extraordinary because they were written at a time when there was a huge amount of stuff which is known now, which is not known then. And you've never put a foot wrong. Your instincts for history were absolutely impeccable. There's not a single thing wrong in any of those things. And the knowledge was not known because you understood something about the process of what it might be. And to do that is very rare. The number of people who can do that is very rare. And I think the answer, therefore, is partnerships, where the different aspects of these are brought together. And I don't see any other way around this. Otherwise, we're going to be living our silos. It's the old story of the two cultures. It's the old story of the two cultures. And if they're going to combine, and I'd say that, you know, the Haig Priestley work, I think is a very fine example of how they do combine. They, you know, profound, detailed understanding of the technology and framed in terms or in sociocultural terms, in historical terms, to historicize, literally to historicize these things. So you need somebody who does the historicizing and somebody who is, and they don't need to be fit, there are huge overlaps, but that focus, that emphasis, the affinity each has with the different discourses is to combine it into a discourse, an integrated discourse. And I think that is part of the problem with software and history of computing, in that the people who know about software are not the people who are used to historicizing things, and that is to provide a cultural discourse for what it is that's going on. But only if that is a meaningful response to how we do it.
It was certainly a very kind response. And it prompts me, if I may, to just say that I, in fact, challenge some of the comments made by Tom Haig, because they turn on the notion of what's meant by programmability. I'll not go off into the issues of the theory of programmability, but I think it is more than just the ability to specify a sequence of instructions. The Colossus was designed by Tommy Flowers with a great deal of generality, a generality that was to be exploited by switches and pluggable cables and the like. As a consequence, the Colossus was used for application, certainly to do with the Lorenz code breaking, which there had been no thought beforehand of being able to, or even of trying to automate. I always get the terminology wrong. The difference between being able to detect the initial placement as opposed to being to detect the setting of all the little cams on the rotors. It was designed for the one sort of problem, and it turned out a degree of generality, and I'm using the word now, generality, as essentially an alternative to the word programmability of Colossus, was such that I think that it really deserves to be in the computing mainstream in a way that in the future we might find other strange devices that aren't as simple as executing a sequential string of instructions. Steps back off soapbox.
My response to your question of challenging Tom Haig about programmability is, what a wonderful conversation to have.
Well, I've had it once with him already.
What's that?
I've had it once with him on.
I mean, what a wonderful conversation for us to have. There was an earlier question from, I've lost the, from Amora. And the name I forgot has appeared on my screen. It's Gerard Alberts in Holland, who has been looking. Yep, Gerard, you know Gerard?
Someone told me about it and I just found the YouTube video.
Okay.
So it's excellent, thanks.
To talk about software as live artifact. Yep.
Oh.
Hello, Gerard.
Yeah. There's a comment from David Link.
Yes.
On the river diagram. Would you like to put your point, David?
Yeah, I made the point that the way I understood the river diagram was not as a complete depiction of the history of computers, but as an example on how to better do the history of computers. So it was a meta statement and not a statement about it wasn't, as far as I understood, it was never meant to be a complete depiction of computer history, but merely a depiction of the way in which we should do computer history.
Absolutely. Yeah, David, thank you. You've rescued me and I thank you for that. Yes, no, you're absolutely right. It was intended as, how do you respond to, the deficiencies of the, yep. Thank you.
I sense, I'm afraid, Doron, that time is going by and we probably should draw to a close. There are many comments that we don't have time to deal with today. I'm sure if people wanted to email you, you'd be happy to continue the discussion with people offline. but it has been a wonderful talk and a very stimulating end to this year's series of lectures by the Computer Conservation Society. The global, literally global audience that you've attracted, I think reflects very well the real respect that the whole community has for your contribution to the preservation and restoration of both hardware and software, and the importance, whenever possible, of actually restoring hardware to working condition in order to be able to run software on it and to actually experience the reality of these machines. We resume these lectures in September. Brian Randall will be giving the first lecture in September, when he will be talking about Percy Ludgate. And we look forward very much to welcoming everybody to the 2021-22 lecture series. Can I just say, our current plan is that we will run them as hybrid events. That's to say, we will offer an opportunity to meet face-to-face if you are able to come to London for the meeting. We will combine that with Zoom, as we have been doing, I hope you'll agree, successfully this year. And in addition, we will continue to make recordings which will be on the Computer Conservation Society YouTube channel, so that if you want to go back and see any of the previous lectures and within hopefully 24 hours or 48 hours, including today's lecture, if you want to listen again to Doron's fascinating talk, we will be offering hybrid meetings in the autumn. So can I wish you all a pleasant summer? I hope at least some of us may be able to get a short holiday and a safe holiday. I wish you all a very happy time. Doron, that was a wonderful close to the year. Thank you for that. And I would invite everybody to wave or to clap or whatever is appropriate. But Doron, that was a fantastic afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thank you.